Welcome everybody to the election rally of Socialist Alliance. You might be joining us through Zoom or through Facebook or YouTube live stream, and we really encourage you to share if you're on one of those platforms to make sure that this gets out as widely as possible. My name is Renee Lees. I'm coming to you from Nudgee country on the outskirts, well, just outside of Cairns, far north Queensland. I acknowledge that we're on stolen land, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land, always was and always will be. We convey our respect to elders all over, and we recommit ourselves to working for justice alongside First Nations. Socialist Alliance, for those of you who haven't had as much involvement as others, is made up of people around Australia who are active in their communities, in their workplaces, in social movements and through elections, in trying to improve the lives of people in the here and now, and also to try to build for a better future for people and for the planet too. Now, we're about to hear from 6 people who are involved in making an impact through upcoming election campaigns of Socialist Alliance. Each will have 3 to 5 minutes to speak, except for our guest speaker, Pat O'Shane, who will have longer to speak, as I know that we're all keen to hear from her. There won't be any questions or discussion in this session, except through the chat, but I encourage you to all get in touch with us later on if you have questions, or keep in touch with Socialist Alliance through our website, Facebook, Twitter, Green Left Weekly, and just talking to us as well is also good. Now, I'm going to jump in first. So as I said, my name is Renee Lees. I'm based in Cairns, far north Queensland. I'm a member of Socialist Alliance, but I'm getting a message from Alex. Keep going, all good? Okay, great. Right, I'm also a candidate in the upcoming federal election for the Queensland Senate, along with my colleague Kamala down in Brisbane as well. Now, we've had a busy few months in far north Queensland already. There's been a lot of energy around this election campaign. It's really allowed us to reach out beyond our networks to build membership exponentially and work with supporters across a number of other movements, which is really exciting times for us up there. So for me, I'm a community lawyer in a community legal centre. I've done that for nearly 20 years or so in regional Queensland, and before that in Central Australia as well. I've been a union member for a couple of decades also, and I'm also a mum of 2 kids here in Cairns, and I've been a community activist for over 2 decades, since I was a teenager, when I first got involved through the rallies against racism with Pauline Hanson when she first came on the scene back in 1996. Now, I've been involved since then in many different movements across many different issues in different places in Australia. But the more that I'm involved, it's really clear to me that we need to join the dots between our movements, that we need to confront the big obstacle that's out there in almost all our movements, which is the system of capitalism that we work under, the tired old system of capitalism that we work under, which is pushing our planet to the brink and forcing people into really harder and more precarious positions in Australia and globally. I really do believe that we do have the power to come together and to regenerate our natural systems, to repair our climate, to improve the system that we work under, to work towards what we call eco-socialism, by which I mean a system which is set up with people and the planet first. Human dignity and ecological health should drive our decisions. And actually, I find more and more that most people agree with us. And together we can make some big change we've made a start with that. Well, we've been doing that as much as we can for some time here in far north Queensland, linking up with people in many other places. But through the current federal election campaign, we've really seen that things are going great guns so far, and we look forward to having an impact through the Senate campaign, but also through the campaign of Pat O'Shane running in our local seat here for Leichhardt, and we'll be hearing shortly from Pat more about that. I think our best chance of making the change that we know we need to make is to join together as a working class, and by that I mean all of us here, the 99%, to run our own workplaces, our own communities, and our world. Now, looking forward to hearing from other speakers this afternoon. We next have Sue Bolton. Sue, are you with us? Yep. Welcome, Sue. Please introduce yourself once you're ready.
Hi. So my name's Sue Bolton. These days I live in Melbourne, which is Wurundjeri country, although right now I'm in Geelong. But I originally do hail from Queensland. There's a few Queenslanders on the platform tonight, although I come from Western Queensland originally, a little place called Tambo, followed by a little place called Quilpie, and that was many moons ago. But I was asked to speak a little bit. I'm standing, for people who don't know, in the seat of Wills for Socialist Alliance. Now, the seat of Wills is located, it's sort of inner Melbourne, but it sort of starts to head towards the outer suburbs. So it's sort of bounded by Brunswick in the south, but goes up to the Western Ring Road, which is just below Broadmeadows. For a lot of people know the Ford Broadmeadows factory, and it sort of goes up into that sort of area. And during the pandemic, I think one of the things that really strikes you out of the pandemic is all the Harvey Norman advertisements. First of all, they started off in the Age and the Herald Sun with pages and pages of advertisements, but it was conveniently in a lift out that you could just lift out and toss away. And of course, they had their equivalent on the web and Facebook, etc. And then they worked out they had to interleave them with the news pages, so you couldn't just lift them out and chuck away. But of course, Harvey Norman, or Jerry Harvey, the owner of Harvey Norman, the super rich owner who is opposed to any kind of benefits for unemployed people or anything for anyone other than the super rich class, yes, that's right. He exemplified the supercharged profiteering during the pandemic. At the beginning of the pandemic, there was a brief moment when the big capitalists thought, oh shit, how are we going to get out of this? But then they quickly worked out how to make megabucks out of the pandemic. And they did this pretty quickly. So no doubt there were some small businesses that went to the wall, but the big businesses really basically made bucket loads, megabucks. And then we saw the rorting of JobKeeper by the wealthiest corporations, where they rorted probably billions, not just millions, but billions of dollars. And unlike JobSeeker, where workers who are unemployed have a mutual obligation to look for X number of jobs, or if they claim $1 extra than what they're entitled to, they have to pay it back. The big business wasn't required to pay back a cent. And then we saw the impact of a partly privatized health system. Luckily, we don't have a situation of the United States where if you have a workplace accident and lose all the fingers in your hand, where you have to choose which finger you can afford to have sewn back on. That's the state in the US. We luckily don't have that in Australia. But what we did see is a partly privatised system. So in Victoria, where all the testing laboratories used to be publicly owned, only a tiny number, not even a handful, are publicly owned now. Most of them are private. So those PCR tests that we used to lining up for, that cost before the pandemic cost $26 per test to process, now cost over $100. Five-fold increase. The private labs told the Victorian government they would not process these tests for COVID-related matters unless they got five-fold increase in what they cost. We saw it's now known as CSL, the only serum laboratory in Australia which was privatised under the Howard government. So they have a total monopoly on the production of anti-venom and vaccinations and all these sorts of things. And this could have been a tremendous resource for Australia in getting out in front with not only vaccinations for COVID, but all sorts of other anti-venoms, etc. In the beginning of the pandemic, the Australian government didn't recommend mask wearing. And they said at the time that, there was no evidence that masks reduce the transmission of the virus. But actually, this was a lie from the very beginning of the pandemic, because actually it was really revealed later on in small print, very small print, so small that most people wouldn't have even noticed it. Apparently, the real reason they didn't recommend mask wearing is because they didn't have enough masks. But they were never honest with the Australian public about that. Instead, they rattled on and lied to us, saying that masks didn't, prevent transmission. The pandemic also exposed the failures of the market at multiple levels. The housing crisis was a crisis before the pandemic, and it was absolutely exacerbated during the pandemic, and it is absolutely one of the top issues really in Australia today, along with the COVID crisis and climate crisis. Some people would remember, they were in the media when COVID infiltrated the community of Wilcannia in far west New South Wales, and there was no housing for people to be able to isolate from their families to stop the spread of COVID to the rest of their families. So the only option they had was white vans. Now, this is scandalous, because it's not like this is a new crisis, it's just been discovered. This has been a crisis of housing for decades in Wilcannia and many other remote Aboriginal communities. So this is a crisis that could have been fixed decades ago. It's not a new crisis. It should really be fixed instantly. Right now, they've got the resources. All of Harvey Norman's millions would solve this. But not only that, we've had the situation of people in the big cities snapping up holiday houses in the regions and causing a housing crisis in regional areas. So a lot of housing groups, the only thing they can offer people who can't find a place to rent or a place that's affordable is to give them a tent and hope they can find a place, or maybe find some vacant land that they can get people to set up tents on. So this, in a super wealthy country like Australia, is a total indication of disaster. And then the fact that our borders have been closed over the last 2 years mostly, and the cost of housing still going up, shows that it's not increasing in population or migration that causes the cost of housing to go up. It's actually speculators, developers who drive up the cost of housing. We've also seen the hierarchy in the workforce, where workers who are treated, as the lowest of the low, have been left behind during the pandemic. So that we saw during, I think it was a Delta outbreak in Sydney, where the hospitals were not providing personal protective equipment to cleaners who had to go in and clean the COVID wards, because of course hospital health workers doesn't just mean nurses and doctors, it actually means food service workers, cleaners, and all sorts of workers in the hospitals. So this whole situation needs to be reversed on multiple levels. I think I'm sort of running out of time, but I think what we need to do and what we need to fight for as part of this election campaign is that we need to rip the ill-gotten profits away from the super wealthy class and redirect it to diverting, bringing back into the public system all the privatized parts of the health system, including these private labs. We need to invest in, at least as a starting point, 1 million public housing units at the very least in regional areas as well as the big cities, as well as introducing rent control and so forth to stop the massive escalation of rents. But we also need to provide, look after workers' rights during this pandemic. We can't be forcing COVID positive workers back to work. We need to be providing proper recompense to workers who test positive or forced to isolate. And we need to be giving every single person who works in the healthcare system with COVID people, from the cleaners to the nurses, we need to be giving extra holiday leave, extra pay, but extra holiday leave in particular, and many other things besides. I think I've spoken over time, so over to all the other wonderful candidates on the platform.
Thanks so much, Sue. And I work in the family violence and homelessness area, and I can absolutely echo what Sue was saying about the impact of the housing crisis in regional Queensland being supercharged during the pandemic. Over next to Angela Carr. Are you with us, Angela?
I am. Thanks, Renee. So, hi, everyone. So I'm coming in from the stolen land of the Wadda Waddarong. My name's Angela Carr. I'm from the Geelong branch. So I'm one of the 2 candidates running in the Victorian Senate alongside Felix Dance. So I'm a union delegate, and I actually work in community services sector in the family violence space too. And I'm a housing justice campaigner. So I think in this federal election campaign, we are going to have a strong focus on inequality. So currently we're actually seeing our supermarket shelves bare and people are losing their minds because they can't get their meat and their veggies. But we actually have people in our communities that cannot afford to purchase these items on a regular basis. So we do have a massive food insecurity issue in our country that's not widely spoken about. And it's people across our country, and they can be in remote communities or urban areas. They actually just don't have access to healthy food or enough food on a daily basis because they are living in poverty. And so what we know is that the capitalist system, it actively and intentionally keeps people in this cycle of poverty through legislations and systems that, impact all areas of our lives. So health, welfare, education, justice, our workplaces, and so on. Sue spoke about the housing crisis really well, but I probably will add that we know that now in this country that housing has just become a commodity. So the basic premise that housing is a human right, it really has been lost to the capitalist wasteland, if you will, because our policy creators, they're benefiting from being our mega rich landlords. So we've got our lowest rates of public housing seen since the 40s, high market rents, wages that don't grow in line with the cost of living, And so the average worker has been priced out of the property and the rental market. And I have to say, I completely reject the discourse from the federal government that housing is a state issue. This is false. So the federal government really does have a strong role to play in addressing the housing crisis that many people in our community are facing. And I say this because you look to a country like Finland, where all levels of government have come together to work together to eradicate homelessness through their housing first model. And I mean, Sue touched on a lot of things that need to be done, and there is so many things that can be done at a federal level, but that commitment to a large scale building program, like that is key. And so we have a lot to campaign on, and we have a lot of comrades across the country that do really good work in this space. I strongly support and advocate for a livable wage for all, and that is for workers or people on income support. When we look at income support, payments are well below the poverty line, and without a permanent doubling of payments, vulnerable people will continue to be unable to maintain their basic human needs, such as shelter, food, access to medical care, employment, and so on. If we move on to the NDIS, I'm pretty passionate about advocating for changes to this system. We know that the system is completely flawed and participants continue to struggle to access the most basic level of service or equipment that they require to lead independent lives. It's completely inequitable, it's very bureaucratic, often your access and your support is determined by your postcode. And those at the margins are pushed out or left largely unsupported. When you think about some of our First Nations communities living in regional and remote areas, there's a critical lack of support services or even the chance to actually get access to the scheme, and little to nothing is being done to address the barriers for people, and it's just simply not good enough. I need to talk about the Punitive Centrelink System, going back to that. Many people might not be aware, but if you have a serious mental health condition, you can rarely gain access to the DSP anymore. So often people will be cut off their job seeker allowance because they can't meet the punitive mutual obligations. And often that's because they're too unwell at that time to participate in employment. And I mean, this also goes to unrealistic mutual obligations for older people, single parents. And if you think about those punitive initiatives like the Basics card, which of course were rolled out to Aboriginal communities first, and this was dreamed up by Twiggy Forrest and fueled by racist policies, I believe it's completely criminal that our government does not support and it continues to punish the most vulnerable in our community. The Centrelink system is another system that really does require a radical overhaul to improve the lives of people in this country. If we think about workers' rights, a lot of people have touched on this today. I mean, it's an absolute no-brainer. If people have insecure or low-paid jobs or can't get employment, people are living in poverty and they will retire into poverty. The healthcare crisis, I probably don't have time to talk about this, but just in terms of changes to Medicare over the last 10 years, there's been a continual slash and burn to Medicare, and it's leaving people unable to access free early intervention treatments. And ultimately, this is resulting in premature and preventable deaths for people in our community. And it's really difficult to access bulk billing, which places a higher demand on our emergency departments. And I won't go there with COVID. So I better wrap it up. But in conclusion, I think as a party, this is a very exciting time for us leading into the federal election. We have some really fantastic, passionate candidates and members across the country. And I think from a socialist perspective, the pandemic really puts us in a strong position to provide real-world examples of struggle that now resonate with a broader layer of society. And we will continue to share our anti-capitalist ideas and continue to break down those popular discourses we see coming from government and media. Those ideologies that pit worker against worker and lead to racist and individualistic values. And, actually we have a really important role in building working class solidarity. So I'm really looking forward to following everyone's campaigns across the country, and I'm sending you my solidarity. And please follow our campaigns in Victoria as well. Thanks, Renee.
Thanks so much, Angela. Really look forward to seeing where that campaign goes in Victoria. Now, if you've just joined us through the live stream, you are with the election rally of Socialist Alliance, where we're hearing from some of our really inspiring candidates in this upcoming federal election. We'll next hear from Andrew Chuter. Andrew?
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Renee. Hi, I'm coming to you from Erskineville, which is Gadigal land, the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm a maths teacher by trade, and by vocation, and an activist and a socialist involved in a lot of different movements. I'm a proud member of the NTU and president of the Friends of Erskineville, and a member of organisations like Eco Transit, supporting public transport, and Action for Public Housing. And I was asked to kind of just touch on how we connect sort of local campaigns to the party building and then the fight for socialism, and Socialist Alliance, and how do we connect that to our election campaigns. So one good example is something that I was involved in just recently with council elections in New South Wales. So we ran candidates in the Inner West Council area, just the inner west of Sydney. And some of you may know that that was a council that was formed through the forced amalgamation of Marrickville, Ashfield and Leichhardt councils. 3 councils actually quite known to be quite generally progressive and democratic councils, but in 2016 under Mike Baird, New South Wales Liberal Premier, they were forcibly amalgamated against very strong opposition from the community that absolutely did not want to be forced amalgamated. And regrettably, over the 5 years that have passed, the amalgamation has been an absolute dismal failure. It was promoted on the grounds that it would be a cost-saving measure. But all the evidence prior to that and ever since has shown that council amalgamations, due to diseconomies of scale, generally do not save money, and actually the net effect is just to reduce local involvement in local democracy and local representation. So due to the great pressure that was coming from the community across New South Wales, particularly in regional areas against these forced amalgamations, there's a pushback to have the councils de-amalgamated back to their original councils. And this is widely felt across New South Wales. So we teamed up with the broader New South Wales de-amalgamation campaign and ran a de-amalgamation campaign within the Inner West. And firstly, we managed to get up successfully, thanks to very much to Pip Hinman and the team's sort of involvement, to get the council to run a poll or non-binding plebiscite at the same time as the council election. So then we basically had a massive platform to run on as Vote Yes for de-amalgamation. And it was a very positive campaign. It was very, voting yes, telling people to vote yes had a real positive ring to it. Our slogan was put the local back into local council. And we put up hundreds and hundreds of core flutes all around, stickers and letterboxed, 50 to 60,000 homes in the entire Inner West. And we're glad to say that there was an overwhelming majority voted yes. In fact, 63% voted yes. So now we're in the situation where the incoming council will be forced to deal with that. The Labor Party did promise that they would follow through on that yes vote in asking for the state to approve the de-amalgamation. And let's hope that, we put together a good case for it. And maybe if the Liberal government refuses it, maybe the state will get a state Labor government in some time, and they might approve it at that stage. But it will take a big fight from the community to get that through. And one of the real reason that we're campaigning on that, and the way we kind of brought our socialist kind of argument in there, is that we believe in democracy, we believe in local democracy and giving people a say. And it counts at the local council level where people can really see what's happening around them, that, they say all politics is local, that people really do understand and appreciate and want to get involved in their local area, in having a say in their local area. And when people do start to get involved in that, it's then they can start to be engaged in politics and see the bigger picture, and people can be often drawn and really draw their own conclusions and realize the problems that we have with capitalism, and that people power, democracy and socialism provide an alternative. So, and we build up our profile within the community as leading activists in that campaign. And so we show to people that we're not just some highfalutin sort of rhetoric, that we're actually hardworking activists on the ground that are actually pushing things forward. And that's how we build our standing in the community that will hopefully get people to, consider voting for us, when we're running in the Senate, as I am with Rachel Evans, or in other elections. So it's been a great campaign, and I encourage people to get involved in whatever local campaigns they can get involved in to push for local improvements in whatever way they can. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Andrew. And we'll be talking more before we leave about how you can get involved in all of this as well. Now, if you're on the live stream and you haven't yet pressed share, please do so right now, because we're about to hear from our guest speaker. And I'm really excited to introduce Pat O'Shane to speak with us next. Pat, we can't hear you. Make sure you unmute there and start again from the top.
Still muted, Pat.
No, still no luck. Can you see that? The microphone button down the bottom left of your screen?
Tried to unmute it several times.
We have you. Great.
Oh, okay, fine. Thank you. Good.
Yes, go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll start at the beginning. I grew up where I'm sitting now. This is a beach suburb outside of Cairns when I was very young. My parents moved here and we lived just in the bush, and we really grubbed our living from the bush and the ocean. And we were dirt poor, I can assure you. My father used to always say, we live like this because of the dirty, rotten, filthy capitalist system. And I tell you what, if he'd lived to now, he'd be even more angry about it. So I grew up realising that part of my job in life was to get rid of this dirty, rotten, filthy capitalist system. Things came to a head for me after I moved. I had moved to Sydney and I lived there for 50 years. Came back here to this beach outside of Cairns to try to restore my health. I'd had a very long period of very poor health, and I was a bit of a loss to know what I was going to do. I wanted to work. I'm not a person who likes to just lie in bed all day. So I thought, okay, I'll get involved in land rights movement up here. Well, I have to say that that's a dog's breakfast. I'll just say in very short terms that the Native Title Act is not worth the paper it's written on, and a lot of non-Indigenous people get caught up in the romance of Indigenous people, First Nations people, having their lands restored to them. One of the places where their lands are not restored to them yet, or not in full at any rate, and where authorities, government authorities at both state and federal level call the tune, is in the Daintree Forest. I was born in the Daintree Forest. That's my country. And I had always wanted to go back there, but not to live. I live down here because this is where I've lived for a very long time. So when I came back, I thought I would get involved in all of that. But then we ran headlong into the pandemic. And what I heard about what was happening down south in respect of a rollout of vaccinations, etc., to places in northwestern Western Australia, where I once had practice as a lawyer, I was absolutely disgusted at the fact that the federal government, who essentially has the responsibility for rolling out the health issues there, had not even started to take any kind of health treatment to people in that far northwest corner of New South Wales. And I became exceedingly angry about that. And my anger builds up and it gets diverted to other things. So when I started to look around, I thought, okay, I'm highly engaged in the climate action campaign because I grew up in the bush. We were taught to cherish our environment. As I said at the outset, we got our food from our environment. We had to walk miles to get water, but at least we were able to have very healthy diets and lots of exercise. And you have to walk a long way to get your water. You certainly get a lot of exercise. The other thing that my parents taught me was that education was very important, and it didn't matter whether it was, a heat wave or whether it was a tropical cyclone. We had to get to school, and if we had to walk, we walked all the way. And if the buses stopped running, we had to walk all the way back. So it was just thoroughly imbued in us that we had to make this world a better place. Then I heard, of course, about the nonsense that went on with Berejiklian, the Premier of New South Wales. She was before ICAC, and she was lying about her relationship with some ne'er-do-well and giving out very large sums of money, pork barrelling seats in his electorate, communities in his electorate. What made me really angry about that was the way that Commonwealth government, in the person of Morrison and others, came in and really slandered the people who had, the lawyers and the persons who worked in the agency about that business, that particular inquiry. Berejiklian, as you know, stepped down, but the story went around, and this was generated by the federal government, that she was pushed out of office. And that was a monstrous lie, of course. Right on top of that, so that now we've already seen two expressions of, I had seen two expressions of corruption. Then we had the further story about Christian Porter. His father used to be in the Cairns Athletics organisation. When I was a kid, he was a high jumper, I was a sprinter. And so I knew him well, but I didn't know his ne'er-do-well son. And I was disgusted with what I heard about that. So it's building up and building up and building up. And next thing I know, we get the pandemic full on. And the lies, the corruption that was being expressed day in, day out by the Commonwealth government was the factor that led me to consider standing for election in this coming federal election. And I don't know how, something must have been in the air, because the next thing that I got was a phone call from Rob Pine, who is one of our members up here, and he said he'd introduced me to Renee. I had heard about Renee because she worked with the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Legal Service, and one of my nephews worked there as a lawyer, and my sister-in-law worked there. And so I had heard about Renee, and I was very pleased to meet her. So when I got through that and Rob put it directly to me, would I join Socialist Alliance? I was very happy to do so. One of the first things my sister-in-law told me was that we really have to go up to the Torres Straits to fight for them, literally to fight for their lands, because as all of you would know, those lands are already drowning. The oceans have already risen, and that's a very tough job that they have on their hands at present. The government is taking no notice of them. And as Renee will know, I said that the very first, once I joined Socialist Alliance, one of the very first places I wanted to visit were the Torres Straits. And my sister-in-law, I'd asked my sister-in-law to accompany me and to introduce me to her relatives and so forth. And since I put that to her, she's been spreading the word that they should vote for me, which will be very nice if they do. Mind you, I'm sitting here close to Cairns and all the way up the east coast of the Cape York Peninsula are relatives of mine. So I'm going to have a long trip from here up to Cape York, the tip of Cape York Peninsula. And what I'm most interested in, first of all, as I told the group down here in Cairns, was climate action. Climate action is a lot of people on the ground, a lot of people in the community, even professionals that I hear are afraid of climate action. What they're afraid of, I believe, is the science that is involved. They seem to believe that they need to understand the science in order to do something about climate action or climate change. It's simple. Some years ago, when I was still living in Sydney, there was a park in front of where my daughters lived, and it had one tree in it. Now, having come from the bush, I couldn't stand having only one tree in the park. So I walked along the street, organised my neighbours to join us, my daughters and I, in getting trees and growing them in that park. And that's what we did one Sunday. One of the girls made the coffee, the other went and got some scones or some such sandwiches, and I did a lot of the hard yakka. Afterwards, we left there, came back one day just to have a look, and the park was an absolute garden, and it was beautiful. The trees had taken, and it was clear that other people in the vicinity were looking after that park. It was such an easy thing to do, and it is such an easy thing to do. People do not understand that trees basically breathe in and breathe out the pollution that is generated by engines, car engines, fires, etc. So we have to start there because it's a very simple thing. People are engaged by simplicity, really. They can't cotton on to the science of it. That's okay. Leave the science to the scientists. That's what they're doing at present. Of course, we have to organise well enough to close down coal mines. Here in Queensland, we have the government living off the interest that it gets in its dealings with Adani. Now, Adani is an abomination, and we absolutely have to have it changed. I cannot possibly go into this election with any sense of making some kind of deal with the Labor Party. And I hope that none of you can do that either. I don't know how anybody could live with their consciences to make a deal with the Labor Party when the Labor Party continues to deal hand in glove with people like Adani. And in the Hunter Valley down in New South Wales, Josh Fitzgibbons, who was always on the side of keeping those coal mines going. So that's where I was with climate change. And I realised that I could do it working with Socialist Alliance. So the next thing I'm passionate about is social housing, of course. If you lived in the hut that I lived in, just a few, 3 sides of galvanised, rusted galvanised iron with a tin roof, a dirt floor, have to walk a long way to get water, just in billies or cut down kerosene tins. You know why I'm passionate about social housing. And what I know still is that right through the peninsula, there are communities of our people who still don't have decent housing. And for that matter, very poor health facilities. Health, housing go together. There's no question about it. Got poor health, got poor housing, you'll have poor health in any community anywhere in the entire world. So health and housing go together, and we need to do something drastic about that. Then, of course, we've got education. So many kids miss out on education further up in the peninsula because governments don't put the resources in there. But then came the worst of all. I became aware here in Queensland that notwithstanding that the Australian government is a signature to the UN Convention on Rights of the Child, we have governments around this country, but particularly here in Queensland, who put kids of 10 years of age into solitary confinement in concrete cells. Now, you'd know that I was a lawyer for 50 years. I did a lot of work in and out of jails. I sat as the Children's Court in New South Wales. I think it is an absolute abomination. No civilised person could possibly say with any real belief that it is necessary to put 10-year-old kids into solitary confinement. Worse in the Northern Territory, when they had that young fellow where they was able to get footage of him wearing a spit hood. So spit hoods now have been, well, allegedly left out of, left on the side. They're not doing that at all. If they get the opportunity to put kids like that into spit hoods and tie them into chairs, they'll do that, because that's what's at the soul of their beings. They blame the illnesses of this society, which they have generated over 200 years now, on these young children. I write frequently to my local newspaper, and whenever I read about youth crime, I'll write a letter to them. They've only published one of my letters, but I keep doing it because we have to keep doing it. We have to keep pressing the point that we cannot behave like this. what we see in the faces of those children are the faces of those people who do that to them. They're not born like that. Those young children are not born like that. And we have to stop this. This Queensland government is no better than any other government as far as I can see. But worse, I've never heard a single Australian government speak out against what state governments do to Indigenous kids that they say are little criminals at the age of 10 years, especially not Morrison, especially not Christian Porter, when he was allegedly the Attorney General. And certainly you would never get it from the likes of Michaelia Cash. So I have been simmering with anger now for a few months, to the point where I'm going to get out there and I'm going to get rid of Ange. I put on Facebook just earlier today, a vote for Ange is a vote for Barnaby Joyce. And I think we can all accept that. Thank you. I think we have to do that. It's true, of course. I actually went through Ange's record in Parliament. I just looked it up when I found that he was the local member here. Well, he had been for a long time. And I've said it several times over since, in that time since. So that's basic. Oh, and absolutely important, apart from, housing, health and education, are jobs, decent jobs with decent levels of wages, living wages. These people in Canberra and in state governments as well are living on, they've been stealing our monies, the public monies, to feather their nests further and further and further, including we've got negative gearing, and we've got offshore tax havens. Those all have to be closed down, and I think you and I are the people to do it. So look out for my posts and Twitters and so forth, and I'll look out for yours, and let's go get them.
Absolutely. Thank you, Pat. We will. We shall go and get them. And one person who's going to tell us a bit more about that, our final speaker, Sam Wainwright.
Thanks very much, Renee, and hi to everyone from Walyalup, which is the proper name for Greater Fremantle, here on Wajak Noongar land. I'm also a Socialist Alliance candidate in the upcoming federal election, along with our Senate team of Katrina, who you heard earlier today, if you were part of the Socialist Alliance National Conference, and Alex Salmon, who's been a long-time industrial correspondent for Green Left. And a big thanks to Pat as well. We're really excited to know that you've got yet another chapter in your activist life, which is fantastic. And we're really going to look forward to campaigning with you. Well, amongst the many different things I've done along the way, in my mid-20s, I lived in France for a while. And so I still follow French politics fairly closely. And there's a left-wing anti-capitalist organisation in France called La France Insoumise, which means France Unbowed or France Unsubmissive. They're probably the most significant far-left campaigning organisation in France, and they're focused on the upcoming presidential elections there. And they're bigger than us, and so they can afford to pay polling companies to do polling for them. And they got a polling company to do a sample, a proper poll, and to take about a dozen of the points from their election platform, which they call our future together, and to ask people whether they supported these dozen points in their platform, which are quite similar to the things that we put forward. Except the polling company didn't say who they were asking this question on behalf of, and there's no socialist language attached to any of these propositions. People were just asked for each of these 12 things, whether they thought they were a good idea or not. And lo and behold, about 80% of people polled agreed with each of those 12 positions they were putting forward. Now, for them, that posed an interesting question, because currently their presidential candidate is getting about 13% in the opinion polls. Of course, we'd be delighted if we were getting 13%, averaging across the whole of Australia. But it poses the question, why is it that the majority of working people agree with socialist solutions to the crisis, the social and economic crises, when it's put to them in kind of non-political language, it's not branded with a party name, doesn't look, it's not particularly socialist, they're just put forward as common sense ideas. 80% say, yeah, we agree with that. But then when it comes time to vote, they go and vote for the pro-capitalist parties. And that's an interesting, that's a question for us as well. Like, what is going on inside working people's heads? How do we reach out to them? And how and when are they going to realise that change is possible? Of course, we know some of the reasons why there's this kind of disjuncture, that capitalist politics, and all the media, capitalist media focus on election day isn't about that stuff. They attempt to divert people with celebrity politics, focus on identity, so-called culture wars. You think in Australia, how racism has been used, or, if you're an Aussie bloke, you're worried that climate action will mean you're going to get your ute taken away from you. Just all this sort of crap that they just sort of bombard people with, and make the elections about anything other than your immediate interests, as counterposed to the capitalists. And we also know the other challenge that we have is that people can often think, and we face this during our election campaigns, that people can think our ideas make a lot of sense, but in the end, they still end up voting for the Labor Party, for instance, because they think that's the more credible or viable or realistic thing to do. And it got me thinking about the fact that, one of the consequences of the progressive winning of universal suffrage, or the right to vote, of working people in this country, first for working men, and then for women, and then for Indigenous people, one of the consequences of that created a new challenge for capitalism. It meant that for the capitalists, the art of politics became pretending to rule on behalf of all Australians while actually ruling on behalf of the capitalists. When you think about it, that's what the art of politics is in a capitalist society. And some politicians are better at it than others, but that's what the game is all about. Now, having said all that, you might say, well, why are we putting this emphasis on the elections then, if it's so hard to get a hearing for common sense, actually not all that radical solution, and not solutions to the crises that people face that are objectively in their interest? Now, I just raise that to make the point that, we need to understand and be sober about the fact that it's out of the context of mass struggle that masses of people will look to socialist solutions. But that doesn't mean our election campaigns aren't important right here and now, even if we're getting votes in the single digits, percentages, that kind of thing. Our election campaigns are important stepping stones towards the sort of change and the sort of political force in Australian politics that we would like to see in the future. Our election campaigns are important, number one, because they enable us to pose anti-capitalist or socialist solutions to the social and ecological crises. And we know there's already an audience for that. But also our campaigns are important because we need to contribute to the building of an anti-capitalist force in Australian politics now. We can't wait for the crisis to come. Now, in saying that, that doesn't mean we think we've got all the answers. Of course we don't. And we know that to build the kind of force in Australian politics that we really need will involve drawing on the experience and the activity of other activists, including people we haven't met yet. People from the union movement who are prepared to break with the Labor Party. People who are prepared to reject the racism that's been a foundation stone of Australian politics. Environmentalists coming to anti-capitalist conclusions. First Nations, community activists, lots of other people. But our election campaigns are both a stepping stone or a building block towards that kind of political alternative in Australia. And they're also a mechanism for us to reaching out and having dialogue with those people and convincing them in the process that we need a political force that recognises that people power, class struggle, to use the old-fashioned language, in the streets, in the workplaces, in the communities, in the schools and the campuses is going to be the motor force for social change, and is what has won all the significant victories, social victories, both in this country and elsewhere. And that's not going to happen if we don't help that process if we don't run in these elections. We don't help that process if we just sit back and say, well, it's enough for people to vote for a kind of a softer left alternatives, such as the Greens or Zali Steggall. You know, it's not enough just to say to people, well, for the time being, a belief in a kind of a green capitalism is good enough, or that there should be some kind of separation between the movement on the streets and the intervention in parliamentary politics, because that's fundamentally not correct. And there's an urgency. There's an urgency to build the kind of political force that we need. And that's demonstrated, for instance, by the way that absolute charlatan, Clive Palmer, with his right-hand man, Craig Kelly, are trying to tap into people's alienation and anger with politics as usual and present themselves as some sort of anti-system. You've seen their wall-to-wall advertising. Don't trust Labor, Liberal, the Greens again, vote UAP. I mean, the idea that this capitalist Clive Palmer in any way, shape or form represents any kind of rebellion against the system, of course, is completely absurd. But for people who haven't got a political compass, but who are angry and have frustration in their lives, they can get sucked in by that sort of stuff. We saw that in the United States with the Trump phenomenon. And also, there's no reason to think that if we do go into recession in this country, now I know lots of people are hurting already, but if we go into a deep recession and the number of people who are really hurting and facing housing insecurity balloons, then there's absolutely no reason not to think that really nasty far-right outfits would not grow in this country, just as they have in Europe. I mean, 2 decades of relentless refugee bashing by Labor and Liberal, on top of Australia's particular history as a colonial settler society based on violent dispossession, means our society is just as ripe for people to fall prey to that kind of politics as anywhere else. So there is an urgency and seriousness to our task, you know. It's not a game for us. But even though we're not arrogant about pretending that, you know, we're on the cusp of great change or we've got all the answers or anything like that, we should nonetheless draw strength from the fact that, as you've even just heard this evening and earlier in the conference, and as you know already, there's already a fantastic diversity of experience in struggle from amongst our members and from amongst our candidates. There's great respect in the community, even though, you know, all proportions guarded. And that's something we should really draw strength from. That's a great platform from which to attempt to push forward and contribute as best we can to build the sort of alternative in Australian politics that we need. What other alternative do we have? So let's do it now. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Now, as you've all heard, a lot of people are at that point that they are ready to imagine another way. And we do have the potential to make a big impact through this upcoming federal election. But we can only make it as big as it could be with your help. We heard from Pat O'Shane, who talked about the need to travel and speak to communities all up Cape York and the Torres Strait Islands to bring light to climate collapse and poverty in its extremist forms, but also to work with all those people on the ground in those regions who are already fighting these battles and working in their communities, and to do so. That's the same with our campaigns across the country, that it's going to cost money to do that sort of travel on the Cape and Torres Strait is very expensive, and that's the same with our campaigns across the country. We need to do fundraising. We need your support in funds if you can, in-kind support, in resourcing, but most importantly in your involvement itself. So there's many ways that you can be involved in these campaigns. These election campaigns, you're already involved in these movements, and we are trying to do elections in a different way as well and ensure that they are all about the movement building that we do every other day. We encourage you to keep up with Socialist Alliance, to keep up through our website, through Facebook, through Twitter, through every other social platform you can imagine. We encourage you to keep up with Green Left Weekly for the latest on all of these campaigns and more. We encourage you to support these election campaigns through in any way you can, really. And as you heard from Pat O'Shane as well, you and I are the people to do it. So I really encourage you all to think yourselves about what you can contribute to these election campaigns. I thank all of the speakers we've heard from this afternoon, this evening, depending on where you are in the country. We have some really exciting times ahead, and we really encourage all of you to come with us.
Thanks everyone for joining this live stream. We will come and please share this video and please support our election campaign. Ooh.